Number 1. Israel Keys. Imagine planning a crime so carefully that even investigators, years later, still can't connect all the dots. Israel Keys wasn't just a killer, he was a strategist. He buried murder kits across the country, traveled thousands of miles to avoid patterns, and chose victims he had no connection to. By the time authorities caught him in 2012, they realized they were dealing with someone who had been operating in the shadows for over a decade. Israel Keys was born in January 1978 in Richmond, Utah, into a large family that lived off the grid. His childhood was unconventional, isolated, deeply religious, and strict. The family moved frequently, eventually settling in Washington state. Keys was homeschooled and raised in a community that distrusted modern society. As a teenager, he joined the United States Army and served from 1998 to 2001. Those who knew him during his service described him as quiet, disciplined, and unremarkable. After leaving the military, Keys moved to Alaska, where he started a construction business and became a father. To neighbors and clients, he seemed like a hard-working contractor, a devoted dad, and a man who kept to himself. But beneath that ordinary exterior was someone living a double life. Keys began committing crimes in the late 1990s. While his first confirmed murder is believed to have occurred around 2001, he was involved in violent offenses earlier, including a reported assault in 1998. What made Keys so dangerous was his method. He didn't follow the typical patterns that help law enforcement catch serial offenders. He traveled extensively, sometimes flying across the country to commit crimes far from where he lived. He would bury kits containing weapons, cash, and tools in remote locations years before using them. He avoided using his phone or credit cards near crime scenes. He selected victims at random, ensuring there was no traceable connection. For years, his crimes went undetected because investigators had no reason to link them. His downfall began in February 2012 when he abducted 18-year-old Samantha Koenig from a coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska, where she worked. Keys forced her into his truck at gunpoint, took her to his home, and later killed her. He then left Alaska for a planned cruise with his family, as if nothing had happened. When he returned, he sent a ransom demand to Samantha's family, along with a disturbing photo that made it appear she was still alive. Investigators quickly realized it was staged. Keys had used her debit card after her death, and those transactions left a digital trail. Federal agents tracked him across several states, eventually arresting him in Texas in March 2012. Once in custody, Keys began to talk, but only on his terms. He admitted to multiple murders but refused to provide specific details unless investigators agreed not to share certain information publicly. He wanted to protect his daughter from knowing the full extent of what he had done. Over months of interrogation, he confessed to killing at least 3 people, including Samantha Koenig and a couple in Vermont in 2011. But investigators believed the real number was much higher. Keys hinted at other victims, described his methods in chilling detail, and explained how he had avoided detection for so long. He spoke about his crimes with an eerie calmness, treating them almost like projects he had planned and executed. Keys never stood trial. In December 2012, while awaiting charges, he took his own life in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. He left behind a note and drawings, but no full confession. His death closed the door on answers that investigators desperately needed. To this day, the FBI believes Keys may have been responsible for as many as 11 murders, but only a fraction have been confirmed. His buried murder kits have never all been recovered, and some of his victims remain unidentified. What makes the case of Israel Keys so unsettling is the level of control he maintained. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't careless. He planned years in advance, operated across state lines, and left almost no evidence behind. Even after his arrest, he controlled the narrative, choosing what to reveal and what to take to his grave. Investigators continue to follow leads, hoping that one day they'll be able to bring closure to families who may never have known their loved one's disappearance was connected to him. Israel Keyes remains one of the most enigmatic and calculating offenders in modern criminal history. A reminder that some predators are far more methodical than we'd like to believe. Number 2. Gary Ridgway. For nearly 2 decades, a shadow moved through the Pacific Northwest, leaving a trail of victims that seemed almost impossible to stop. Women disappeared from the streets of Seattle and King County, their bodies later found in remote wooded areas, along riverbanks, and in overgrown fields. The man responsible wasn't a criminal mastermind or a cunning manipulator. He was a truck painter, a churchgoer, and someone who blended so seamlessly into everyday life that even those closest to him had no idea. His name was Gary Ridgway, and by the time he was caught, he had become one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Gary Leon Ridgway was born in February 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, and raised in a working-class neighborhood near Seattle, Washington. His childhood was troubled. He wet the bed well into his teenage years, a behavior that caused tension at home. His mother was reportedly domineering, and his relationship with her was complicated and unhealthy. Ridgway struggled in school, eventually graduating with a low IQ score, and later joined the Navy, serving during the Vietnam War. After his military service, he returned to Washington, married, and settled into a job painting trucks for a local company. To those who knew him, he seemed unremarkable. A quiet, polite man who attended church regularly and lived a simple life. But beneath that facade, something far darker was taking shape. Ridgway's crimes began in 1982, during a period when he was going through personal turmoil, including a divorce. He targeted vulnerable women, many of whom were involved in street-based work or struggling with addiction. He picked them up along Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road known for its high-risk activity, and took them to secluded areas. After killing them, he would dump their bodies in wooded locations, often returning to the sites later. Some victims were found in clusters near the Green River, which is how he earned the name the Green River Killer. Others were discovered miles apart, scattered across King County. The murders continued throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, with investigators estimating that Ridgway killed most of his victims between 1982 and 1984, though he continued sporadically for years afterward. His last confirmed murder took place in 1998. For investigators, the case was a nightmare. The bodies kept appearing, but there were few solid leads. Ridgway had been interviewed multiple times over the years, including in 1983, when a boyfriend of one of the victims pointed police in his direction. He even passed a polygraph test. In 1987, he was questioned again after another victim was linked to him, but there still wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest. The case went cold, but detectives never gave up. They preserved evidence, hoping that one day advancing technology might give them the break they needed. That break came in 2001, when DNA technology had improved significantly. Investigators retested evidence from several victims and found a match: Gary Ridgway. He was arrested in November 2001 at his workplace, more than 20 years after his first known murder. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA linked him to multiple victims, and once in custody, Ridgway began to cooperate. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he agreed to confess to his crimes and help locate remains that had never been found. Over months of interviews, he admitted to killing 48 women, though he claimed the actual number could be as high as 70 or 80. He described his methods in disturbing detail, explaining how he would sometimes return to dump sites, how he moved bodies to confuse investigators, and how he selected his victims based on opportunity. In 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional life sentence for tampering with evidence. In 2011, he pleaded guilty to a 49th murder after remains were identified. He remains incarcerated at Washington State Penitentiary, where he will spend the rest of his life. Families of his victims have spoken publicly over the years, some expressing relief that he was finally caught, others haunted by the decades of uncertainty before his arrest. Gary Ridgway's case is a chilling reminder of how someone can hide in plain sight for years, committing unspeakable acts while maintaining an outwardly normal life. He wasn't brilliant. He wasn't particularly careful. What allowed him to evade capture for so long was a combination of targeting vulnerable people, operating during a time when forensic technology was limited, and simply being patient. His story underscores the importance of persistence in investigations and the power of science to deliver justice, even decades after a crime. The Green River Killer is now a name frozen in criminal history, but for the families of his victims, the pain remains as real as ever. Number 3. Harold Shipman Trust is the foundation of the doctor-patient relationship. When you sit in a clinic, you assume the person across from you has your best interests at heart. For hundreds of patients in Hyde, England, that trust was placed in a well-respected general practitioner named Harold Shipman. He was known as a caring, attentive physician who made house calls, spent time with elderly patients, and seemed genuinely dedicated to his work. But behind that compassionate exterior was a man who used his position to carry out one of the most disturbing killing sprees in modern history. By the time authorities uncovered the truth, it was almost too late to comprehend the scale of what he had done. Harold Frederick Shipman was born in January 1946 in Nottingham, England. He was the second of 4 children and grew up in a working-class family. His mother was a significant figure in his life, and her death from lung cancer when Shipman was a teenager had a profound impact on him. He went on to study medicine at the University of Leeds, where he met his future wife. After graduating, Shipman worked at various practices before settling in Hyde, Greater Manchester, in 1977. He opened his own practice and quickly became a beloved figure in the community. Patients appreciated his willingness to visit them at home, his gentle bedside manner, and the personal attention he gave to their care. He was married with 4 children and lived what appeared to be a stable, respectable life. No one suspected that this trusted doctor was quietly ending the lives of those who depended on him. Shipman's method was as simple as it was horrifying. He would visit elderly patients, often women, in their homes or see them at his practice. He would then administer a lethal dose of a controlled substance, typically through injection, and the patient would die shortly afterward. He falsified medical records to make it appear that the deaths were due to natural causes or pre-existing conditions. Because his victims were elderly and often in poor health, their deaths rarely raised immediate suspicion. In many cases, Shipman himself signed the death certificates, ensuring that no one else would question the circumstances. This pattern continued for years, with Shipman killing patients with alarming frequency, sometimes multiple people in a single week. The first real red flag came in March 1998, when another local doctor became concerned about the high death rate among Shipman's patients. A formal investigation was launched, but it initially found no evidence of wrongdoing. However, suspicions deepened later that year, when Shipman was named as the sole beneficiary in the will of one of his patients, Kathleen Grundy, a wealthy former mayor who had died suddenly in June 1998. Her daughter, a lawyer, immediately questioned the legitimacy of the will and requested a post-mortem examination. Toxicology results revealed a lethal level of morphine in her system, and further investigation uncovered a pattern of similar deaths. Police exhumed the bodies of several other former patients, and in case after case, they found evidence of fatal overdoses. Shipman was arrested in September 1998 and charged with multiple counts of murder. The trial began in October 1999 and lasted nearly 6 months. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including medical records that had been altered, witness testimony from relatives of victims, and toxicology reports showing lethal levels of drugs in the exhumed bodies. Shipman maintained his innocence throughout, offering no explanation and showing little emotion. In January 2000, he was found guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to 15 concurrent life terms, with the judge recommending that he never be released. A subsequent public inquiry, completed in 2005, concluded that Shipman had killed at least 215 patients over a period spanning more than 2 decades, with his final confirmed murder occurring in July 1998. Some estimates suggest the true number could be as high as 250, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. Shipman never admitted to his crimes. In January 2004, one day before his 58th birthday, he was found hanged in his cell at Wakefield Prison. His death raised questions and anger among the families of his victims, many of whom felt cheated of the opportunity to hear him explain why he had done what he did. To this day, his motive remains unclear. Some experts believe he was driven by a God complex, a desire to have control over life and death. Others suggest he may have derived satisfaction from the grief and attention that followed each death. Without a confession, the world is left with questions that will never be answered. The case of Harold Shipman shattered public trust in the medical profession and led to significant changes in the way deaths are investigated in the United Kingdom. New protocols were introduced to monitor doctors more closely, especially regarding the prescribing of controlled substances and the signing of death certificates. Shipman's victims were real people, mothers, grandmothers, friends, and neighbors, whose lives were stolen by someone they trusted. His story is a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a white coat and a reassuring smile. Number 4. Javed Iqbal. Some crimes are so unimaginable that even hardened investigators struggle to process the details. In the winter of 1999, authorities in Lahore, Pakistan, received a letter that would lead them to one of the most horrific cases in the country's history. The letter was a confession. The man who wrote it claimed to have murdered 100 boys over the span of just over a year. He provided details, locations, and even photographs as proof. His name was Javed Iqbal, and what followed was a case that shocked not only Pakistan, but the entire world. Javed Iqbal was born in 1956 in Lahore into a middle-class family. Little is publicly known about his early life, but by the time he reached adulthood, he was living a transient lifestyle. He moved frequently, rented different properties, and kept to himself. Neighbors who later spoke to investigators described him as quiet, unremarkable, and someone who avoided drawing attention. There were no obvious signs of the darkness that lay beneath the surface. Iqbal had been arrested in the past on allegations involving minors, but he was released, and the incidents did not lead to serious consequences. By 1998, he had begun a killing spree that would become one of the most chilling in criminal history. Iqbal targeted vulnerable boys, many of whom were runaways or from impoverished families. He lured them with promises of work, food, or a place to stay. Once he gained their trust, he would take them to one of his rented properties. What happened next is almost too disturbing to recount in detail. The boys were subjected to terrible abuse before being killed. Iqbal later claimed that he would strangle his victims and then dissolve their remains in barrels of acid to destroy the evidence. He kept photographs of many of the boys, along with their clothing and identification, as trophies. Over the course of roughly 18 months, from 1998 into late 1999, Iqbal killed again and again, operating with a level of cruelty that left even seasoned detectives shaken. The case came to light in December 1999 when Iqbal mailed a letter to a local newspaper and to authorities. In it, he confessed to killing 100 boys. He included photographs, descriptions, and even mentioned specific locations where evidence could be found. He taunted investigators, saying they would never catch him. Police raided the address he had listed in the letter and found a scene that confirmed his claims. Inside the property were bloodstains, chains, photographs of victims, and 2 barrels containing human remains dissolved in acid. The scale of the crimes was almost incomprehensible. As news of the confession spread, families across Lahore began coming forward, reporting sons who had gone missing over the past year. Many of them recognized their children in the photographs found at the scene. A massive manhunt was launched. Javed Iqbal had fled, but he didn't stay hidden for long. In December 1999, just weeks after his confession, he turned himself in at the offices of a major newspaper, accompanied by 2 accomplices who had assisted him in some of the crimes. He told reporters he wanted to surrender because he feared being killed by police or vigilante mobs. He was taken into custody, and the legal process began. The trial was swift. Iqbal was charged with 100 counts of murder, along with additional charges. He initially confessed in graphic detail, but later tried to recant, claiming he had fabricated the entire story as revenge against the police for previous mistreatment. The evidence, however, was overwhelming. In March 2000, Iqbal and his accomplices were found guilty. The judge handed down a sentence that shocked the world. Iqbal was to be executed in the same manner he had killed his victims. He was to be strangled. Then his body was to be dismembered and dissolved in acid in front of the victims' families. It was a sentence intended to mirror the horror he had inflicted. International human rights organizations condemned the sentence as inhumane, and it was later commuted by Pakistan's High Court to death by hanging. But Javed Iqbal never faced that execution. In October 2001, he was found dead in his cell, along with one of his accomplices. Authorities ruled it a double suicide by hanging, though the circumstances raised questions and conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Some believe Iqbal took his own life out of fear or guilt. Others suspect foul play, either from fellow inmates or from officials who wanted to avoid the controversy of carrying out the original sentence. Whatever the truth, his death closed the case, but left many without the closure they sought. The case of Javed Iqbal remains one of the darkest chapters in Pakistan's criminal history. He targeted the most vulnerable, exploited their trust, and destroyed countless families. The boys he killed were sons, brothers, and children whose lives had value and promise. His actions exposed gaps in how missing children cases were handled and sparked difficult conversations about child safety and law enforcement in Pakistan. Even now, more than 2 decades later, his name is synonymous with evil, a reminder of how cruelty can thrive in the shadows when society's most vulnerable are overlooked. Number 5. Santa Kimis and Kenneth Kimis Jr. Most people think of serial criminals as lone wolves, operating in isolation. But some of the most dangerous partnerships in criminal history have been between 2 people who enable and escalate each other's worst impulses. In the late 1990s, a mother and son duo named Santa Kimis and Kenneth Kimis Jr. went on a crime spree that spanned multiple states and left a trail of victims in their wake. They weren't just petty thieves. They were con artists, kidnappers, and eventually murderers. By the time they were caught, investigators realized they had been operating for years, leaving chaos and tragedy wherever they went. Sante Kimis was born in 1934 in Oklahoma. She had a difficult childhood and grew up in poverty. As an adult, she became involved in a series of schemes and cons, often targeting wealthy individuals. She married Kenneth Kimes Sr., a wealthy real estate developer, in the 1970s, and together they lived a lavish lifestyle, funded in part by legitimate business and in part by criminal activity. Sante was known for her charm and ability to manipulate people, but she was also volatile and controlling. Her son, Kenneth Kimes Jr., was born in 1975 and raised in an environment where crime was normalized. Sante homeschooled him, isolated him from others, and trained him to assist in her schemes. By the time he was a teenager, Kenneth Jr. was fully enmeshed in his mother's criminal world, acting as her accomplice and enforcer. The Kimes duo was involved in a wide range of illegal activities, including fraud, identity theft, and arson. They moved frequently, used fake names, and targeted vulnerable people. But their crimes escalated dramatically in the late 1990s. In 1998, they set their sights on Irene Silverman, a wealthy 82-year-old woman who owned a Manhattan townhouse. Sante wanted the property, and she devised a plan to take it. She and Kenneth Jr. rented an apartment in Silverman's building under false identities, with the goal of gaining her trust and eventually stealing her assets. But Irene Silverman was no fool. She became suspicious of the mother and son, told friends she didn't trust them, and asked her staff to keep an eye on them. On July 5, 1998, Irene Silverman disappeared. She was last seen in her townhouse that morning, and by the afternoon, she was gone. Her body has never been found. Investigators believe that Sante and Kenneth Jr. killed her in her own home, disposed of her remains, and then attempted to forge documents to claim ownership of her property. The plan unraveled quickly. Suspicious activity and witness statements led police to the Kimes duo, and they were arrested just days later. When officers searched their belongings, they found a mountain of evidence: fake identification documents, notebooks detailing their plans, a stun gun, and even a bag that had belonged to Irene Silverman. The case went to trial in 2000. Prosecutors laid out a chilling picture of a mother and son who had conspired to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Kenneth Kimes Sr. had died in 1994, and after his death, Sante and Kenneth Jr. had become even more reckless. Evidence emerged linking them to other suspicious deaths and disappearances, including the 1998 murder of David Kasdan, a man who had been involved in one of their fraud schemes. Both were charged with multiple counts, including murder, conspiracy, and grand larceny. Kenneth Jr. initially stood trial alongside his mother, but eventually he agreed to testify against her in exchange for a reduced sentence. In his testimony, he admitted to being involved in Irene Silverman's death and described the extent of their criminal partnership. In 2000, both Sante and Kenneth Kimes Jr. were convicted of multiple charges related to the murder of Irene Silverman. Sante was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kenneth Jr. was also sentenced to life, though he later received additional time for the murder of David Kasdan. Sante Kimis continued to maintain her innocence, even as more evidence emerged against her. She remained incarcerated until her death in 2014 at the age of 79. Kenneth Kimes Jr. is still serving his sentence and will likely remain in prison for the rest of his life. The case of Sante and Kenneth Kimes is a disturbing example of how toxic relationships can lead to escalating violence. Sante was a master manipulator who used her son as a tool to carry out her schemes, and Kenneth Jr., raised in that environment, became complicit in terrible acts. Irene Silverman was a strong, independent woman whose life was stolen by two people who saw her only as an obstacle. Her family has spoken about the pain of never being able to lay her to rest, as her remains have never been recovered. The Kimis duo's crimes were not just about greed. They were about control, entitlement, and a complete disregard for human life. Their story is a reminder that some of the most dangerous criminals are those who operate in pairs, feeding off each other's worst instincts. Number 6. Alfred Gaynor. Some killers target strangers. Others prey on people they know. And then there are those who operate within a specific community, exploiting trust and familiarity to commit terrible acts. Alfred Gaynor was one of those offenders. Between 1995 and 1998, he murdered 9 women in Springfield, Massachusetts, in a series of attacks that left the city shaken and grieving. What made the case even more disturbing was that Gaynor knew many of his victims, and some of them trusted him. By the time he was caught, investigators realized they were dealing with someone who had been hiding in plain sight. Alfred Gaynor was born in 1966 in Springfield, Massachusetts. He grew up in the city and was known to people in the community. By all outward appearances, he seemed like an ordinary man. He had relationships, worked occasional jobs, and blended into the neighborhood. But beneath that surface, Gaynor harbored violent tendencies that would eventually lead to a string of brutal murders. He didn't fit the stereotype of a loner or an outsider. He was part of the community, which made it easier for him to gain access to vulnerable women who might not have seen him as a threat. Gaynor's victims were women he knew, either personally or through mutual acquaintances. Many of them were involved in activities that placed them at higher risk, including substance use or street-based work. Gaynor exploited their, vulnerability. He would approach them, sometimes offering help or companionship, and then attack them when they were alone. His crimes were violent and personal. He assaulted his victims before killing them, often leaving their bodies in abandoned buildings, wooded areas, or other secluded locations. The murders began in 1995 and continued sporadically over the next 3 years. By April 1998, when he was finally arrested, 9 women had lost their lives. The investigation into the Springfield murders was complex. Because the victims came from marginalized communities, their disappearances didn't always receive immediate attention. But as the body count grew, law enforcement began to see patterns. Detectives worked tirelessly to connect the cases, interviewing witnesses, analyzing evidence, and building a timeline. The breakthrough came in April 1998, when investigators linked Gaynor to several of the victims. DNA evidence played a crucial role in tying him to the crimes, and witness testimony placed him with the women shortly before they were killed. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The legal process stretched over several years. Gaynor initially pleaded not guilty, but as the evidence mounted, he eventually changed his plea. In 2000, he admitted to killing 4 women and was sentenced to multiple life terms. But that wasn't the end of the story. In 2010, he pleaded guilty to an additional 5 murders, bringing the total to 9 confirmed victims. With each plea, more details emerged about the scope of his crimes and the lives he had destroyed. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and remains incarcerated to this day. Alfred Gaynor's case is a painful reminder of how some victims are overlooked by society. The women he killed were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. Many of them were struggling with addiction or poverty, and their deaths were not always treated with the urgency they deserved. Community advocates in Springfield worked hard to ensure that their stories were told and that their lives were remembered. Gaynor's arrest brought some measure of justice, but it also exposed systemic failures in how vulnerable populations are protected and how their disappearances are investigated. What makes Gaynor's story particularly unsettling is the fact that he operated for years without being caught. He wasn't particularly careful or sophisticated. He was simply someone who understood how to exploit trust and how to target people who might not be immediately missed. His crimes left deep scars in Springfield, a city that had to confront the reality that a predator had been living among them. Gaynor's case also highlights the importance of DNA technology and persistent investigative work in solving cold cases. Without advances in forensic science, it's possible that some of his victims would never have received justice. Alfred Gaynor will spend the rest of his life behind bars, but the pain he caused will last much longer. Number 7. Donato Bilancia. Italy is known for its rich history, stunning landscapes, and vibrant culture. But in the late 1990s, a stretch of coastline along the Italian Riviera became the backdrop for a series of murders that horrified the nation. Between October 1997 and April 1998, a man named Donato Bilancia killed 17 people in a 6-month rampage that seemed almost random in its brutality. He targeted men, women, young and old, in a variety of settings. By the time he was caught, Italy was gripped by fear, and investigators were struggling to understand what had driven him to such violence. Donato Bilancia was born in July 1951 in Genoa, Italy. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood and lived a relatively quiet life. He worked as a security guard and later as a truck driver, and he was known to friends and acquaintances as a loner who kept to himself. Bilancia was an avid gambler and spent much of his free time in casinos and betting shops. Those who knew him described him as reserved, sometimes odd, but not threatening. There were no obvious signs that he was capable of the violence that would later define him. But by the mid-1990s, something inside Bilancia had shifted. He began to harbor deep resentments, particularly toward people he believed had wronged him. Bilancia's killing spree began in October 1997, and it escalated quickly. His first victims were people he knew personally, individuals he blamed for his gambling losses or other perceived slights. He shot them execution style, often in their homes or places of work. But as the weeks went on, his attacks became more random. He began targeting strangers, including people he encountered on trains, in gas stations, and at highway rest stops. He shot some victims, stabbed others, and in one case, set fire to a building. His crimes were not driven by a single motive. Some appeared to be acts of revenge, others seemed to be opportunistic, and still others were simply senseless acts of violence. One of the most disturbing aspects of Bilancia's spree was his targeting of vulnerable people. He killed elderly jewelry store owners, a young woman traveling alone on a train, and even a priest. He seemed to choose his victims based on convenience and opportunity rather than any coherent pattern. This randomness made it difficult for investigators to predict where he would strike next. Panic spread along the Riviera as news of the murders dominated headlines. People were afraid to travel alone, businesses hired extra security, and communities were on edge. The breakthrough in the case came in April 1998 when police received a tip that led them to Bilancia. Surveillance footage and witness descriptions helped investigators identify him, and he was arrested in May 1998 without resistance. When questioned, Bilancia confessed to the murders in chilling detail. He showed little emotion and offered only vague explanations for his actions, citing grudges, bad luck, and a general sense of being wronged by the world. He was charged with 17 counts of murder and numerous other offenses, including attempted murder and arson. The trial began in 1999 and drew massive public attention. Bilancia's defense team argued that he suffered from mental illness, but prosecutors presented evidence of a man who had planned his attacks, taken steps to avoid capture, and acted with clear intent. In 2000, Donato Bilancia was found guilty of all charges. He was sentenced to 13 consecutive life terms, the maximum allowed under Italian law. He was sent to a high-security prison, where he remains to this day. The case of Donato Balancia, often referred to as the Liguria Monster, is a stark reminder that violence can erupt without warning, even in the most peaceful settings. His victims were ordinary people going about their daily lives, and their deaths left entire communities traumatized. Families were torn apart, businesses closed, and a region known for its beauty became associated with tragedy. Balancia's motives remain murky. He spoke of feeling humiliated and angry, of wanting to strike back at a world he felt had treated him unfairly. But his explanations never fully accounted for the scope of his crimes. Italy's legal system does not have the death penalty, so Balancia will spend the rest of his life in prison. His case prompted discussions about mental health, the warning signs of violence, and the role of law enforcement in preventing such tragedies. For the families of his victims, the pain is ongoing. Some have spoken publicly about their loss, while others have chosen to grieve privately. The Riviera has healed, but the memory of those 6 months in 1998 lingers. Donato Balancia's name is forever tied to one of the darkest chapters in modern Italian history. Number 8. Eric Robert Rudolph. Imagine being at a public event, surrounded by crowds, music, and celebration, when suddenly, in an instant, everything changes. That's what happened during the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta, Georgia, when a pipe detonation tore through Centennial Olympic Park, killing 2 people and injuring over 100 others. The attack shocked the world, and it was just the beginning. The man responsible, Eric Robert Rudolph, would go on to carry out a series of bombings over the next 2 years, targeting places he viewed as symbols of what he believed was moral decay. His crimes were driven by extremist ideology, and his ability to evade capture for years made him one of the most wanted fugitives in the United States. Eric Robert Rudolph was born in September 1966 in Merritt Island, Florida. He was raised in a deeply religious household and grew up in rural North Carolina. His family held strong anti-government and anti-establishment views, and Rudolph was homeschooled in an environment that emphasized survivalism and distrust of authority. As a young man, he briefly joined the Army, but was discharged after a short time. He returned to North Carolina, where he lived a quiet, isolated life in the mountains. To those who knew him, he seemed like a recluse, someone who preferred the solitude of the wilderness to the company of others. But beneath that quiet exterior, Rudolph was developing a radical worldview shaped by extremist beliefs. Rudolph's first attack took place on July 27, 1996, during the Summer Olympics in Atlanta. He placed a homemade device in a backpack and left it in Centennial Olympic Park, a gathering place for athletes, tourists, and locals. The device detonated in the early hours of the morning, killing one woman directly and contributing to the death of a cameraman who suffered a fatal heart attack while rushing to the scene. More than 100 others were injured. The attack was intended to disrupt the Olympics and draw attention to Rudolph's anti-government and anti-choice views. Security guard Richard Jewell was initially suspected, and his life was turned upside down by media scrutiny, though he was later cleared. The real perpetrator, Eric Rudolph, had already disappeared. Over the next 2 years, Rudolph carried out additional attacks. In January 1997, he targeted a women's health clinic in Atlanta, setting off 2 devices that injured several people. In February 1997, he struck again, this time at a nightclub in Atlanta. The attack there was particularly devastating. 1 person was killed and several others were seriously injured. His final confirmed attack occurred in January 1998, when he targeted another clinic in Birmingham, Alabama. A security guard named Robert Sanderson was killed in that blast, and a nurse was severely injured. Rudolph's attacks were carefully planned, and he used similar methods each time, constructing devices from commonly available materials and leaving them in places designed to cause maximum harm. After the Birmingham attack, Rudolph became a fugitive. The FBI launched a massive manhunt, and his face appeared on wanted posters across the country. But Rudolph had vanished into the Appalachian wilderness, an area he knew intimately. For more than 5 years, he lived off the land, hiding in the mountains of North Carolina, scavenging food and avoiding detection. The search for him became one of the longest and most expensive manhunts in U.S. history. Despite the resources poured into finding him, Rudolph remained elusive, a ghost in the forests. His luck ran out in May 2003 when he was spotted by a rookie police officer in Murphy, North Carolina, rummaging through a dumpster behind a grocery store. He was arrested without incident, and investigators finally had the man they had been hunting for years. In custody, Rudolph admitted to all 4 bombings and explained his motivations. He described himself as a soldier, fighting against what he saw as government overreach and immoral institutions. He expressed no remorse for the people he had killed or injured. In 2005, Eric Robert Rudolph pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, and is currently incarcerated in the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. His case highlighted the dangers of domestic extremism and the challenges law enforcement faces in tracking down individuals who operate alone and are willing to live off the grid. Rudolph's victims were ordinary people: a mother attending a concert, a security guard doing his job, medical professionals providing care. Their lives were forever changed by a man who believed his ideology justified violence. Eric Rudolph's story is a reminder that terror doesn't always come from foreign shores. Sometimes it grows in the heart of someone who feels so certain of their beliefs that they are willing to destroy innocent lives to make a point. His case remains one of the most significant examples of domestic extremism in modern American history, and it serves as a sobering lesson about the cost of radicalization. Number 9. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. Los Angeles is a sprawling city full of life, diversity, and millions of stories. But for nearly 2 decades, a shadow moved through its streets, preying on women in some of the city's most vulnerable neighborhoods. The killer was methodical, targeting women involved in street-based activities and then disappearing without a trace. For years, investigators struggled to connect the cases, unaware that they were dealing with a serial offender who had been operating since the 1980s. His name was Lonnie David Franklin Jr., and he would eventually become known as the Grim Sleeper, a nickname that referred to the long gap between his known crimes. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was born in August 1952 in Los Angeles. He grew up in South Los Angeles and later served in the United States Army, including a stint in Germany. After his military service, he returned to California, where he worked as a trash collector and later as a mechanic for the city. To those who knew him, he seemed like an ordinary man, a father, a city employee, someone who lived a quiet life in his neighborhood. He was married and had children, and neighbors described him as friendly, if somewhat private. No one suspected that behind this unremarkable exterior was someone capable of committing horrific crimes. Franklin's known crimes began in the mid-1980s. He targeted women in South Los Angeles, many of whom were involved in activities that placed them at higher risk. He would approach them, often in his car, and offer them rides or money. Once he had them isolated, he would attack them. Some survived, though they were left with terrible trauma. Others were killed, their bodies discarded in alleys, dumpsters, or vacant lots. Franklin's attacks were violent, and he showed no mercy. But what made his case so challenging for investigators was the long period of time over which the crimes occurred, and the gaps between known incidents. The first wave of murders linked to Franklin took place between 1985 and 1988. Then, for reasons that remain unclear, the killings appeared to stop. This gap, which lasted more than a decade, is why he was nicknamed the Grim Sleeper. When the murders resumed in 2002, investigators initially didn't connect them to the earlier cases. It wasn't until advances in DNA technology allowed cold case detectives to re-examine old evidence that the links became clear. In 2010, using a technique called familial DNA searching, investigators identified Lonnie Franklin Jr. as a suspect. His DNA was a partial match to evidence from several crime scenes, and further investigation confirmed that he was connected to multiple murders. Franklin was arrested in July 2010. A search of his home uncovered hundreds of photographs and videos of women, many of whom appeared to be unconscious or unaware they were being recorded. Investigators feared that some of the women in the photos might be additional victims, and they released images to the public in hopes that people would come forward with information. The investigation revealed that Franklin had been documenting his crimes, keeping trophies, and possibly killing far more people than the cases for which he was charged. The trial began in 2016. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including DNA matches, witness testimony from survivors, and the disturbing collection of photographs found in Franklin's home. He was charged with 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, though investigators believe the true number of victims could be much higher. Franklin maintained his innocence throughout, but the evidence was undeniable. In May 2016, he was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death and placed on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Lonnie Franklin Jr. died in March 2020 while awaiting execution. His death brought a complicated kind of closure. For some families, it meant the end of a long and painful chapter. For others, it meant that questions about additional victims would never be fully answered. The women Franklin killed were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. Many of them came from communities that had been historically underserved by law enforcement, and their deaths were not always treated with the urgency they deserved. Advocates worked hard to ensure that their stories were told and that their lives were remembered. The case of the Grim Sleeper is a reminder of how some predators can operate for years, hiding in plain sight, while their crimes go unnoticed or unsolved. It also highlights the importance of advances in forensic science, particularly DNA technology, in bringing justice to victims and their families. Lonnie Franklin Jr. lived an ordinary life on the surface, but beneath it, he was a predator who caused immeasurable pain. His story is a sobering example of how evil can exist in the most unexpected places. Number 10. Franklin Dwayne Alex. Not every serial killer becomes a household name. Some operate quietly, their crimes only coming to light during investigations that reveal a pattern of violence hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. Franklin Dwayne Alex was one of those offenders. Between 1997 and 1998, he was responsible for the deaths of at least 4 women in the United States, though investigators believe there may be more victims who were never linked to him. His crimes were brutal, his victims were vulnerable, and his ability to evade suspicion for as long as he did speaks to the challenges law enforcement faces when dealing with predators who target marginalized communities. Franklin Dwayne Alex was born in the mid-1960s and lived much of his life in the southern United States. Details about his early life are limited, as he was not someone who drew public attention before his crimes came to light. He worked various jobs and moved between cities, which allowed him to avoid creating a clear pattern that might have alerted authorities earlier. Those who knew him described him as unremarkable, someone who blended into the background and didn't stand out in any particular way. But beneath that ordinary exterior was a man capable of terrible violence. Alex's known victims were women he encountered in different cities. Many of them were involved in activities that placed them at higher risk, including street-based work and substance use. He would approach them, gain their trust, or exploit their vulnerability, and then attack them. His crimes were violent and personal, and he showed no regard for the lives he was destroying. The murders took place between 1997 and 1998, a period during which Alex was moving between locations, making it difficult for investigators to connect the cases. The investigation into Alex's crimes was complicated by the fact that his victims came from communities that were often overlooked by law enforcement. Their disappearances didn't always receive immediate attention, and in some cases, their deaths were initially attributed to other causes or left unsolved. But as investigators began to re-examine cold cases and use advances in forensic technology, patterns began to emerge. DNA evidence played a crucial role in linking Alex to multiple crime scenes, and witness testimony helped fill in gaps in the timeline. Alex was eventually arrested and charged with 4 proven murders. The legal process that followed was thorough, with prosecutors presenting evidence that painted a clear picture of a man who had targeted vulnerable women over a sustained period. Alex was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to life in prison. He remains incarcerated, and there is no possibility of parole. Investigators have continued to review unsolved cases to determine if there are additional victims who can be linked to him, though no new charges have been filed. The case of Franklin Dwayne Alex is a reminder of how some predators operate in the shadows, targeting people society too often overlooks. His victims were real people with families, dreams, and struggles. Their deaths left scars on their communities, and their stories deserve to be told. Alex's crimes also highlight the importance of advances in forensic science and the dedication of cold case investigators who refuse to let cases go unsolved. What makes Alex's story particularly frustrating is the fact that he was able to operate for as long as he did without being caught. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He didn't have elaborate plans or sophisticated methods. He simply took advantage of the fact that his victims were often invisible to the systems that were supposed to protect them. His arrest and conviction brought some measure of justice, but it also exposed failures in how certain communities are policed and how certain victims are treated. Franklin Dwayne Alex will spend the rest of his life in prison, but the pain he caused will last much longer. His case is a sobering reminder that justice is not always swift, and that some crimes only come to light because of the tireless work of investigators who refuse to give up. The women he killed deserved better, from society, from the systems that were supposed to protect them, and from a world that too often looked the other way. Their stories are a call to do better, to pay attention, and to ensure that no one is forgotten.